On to testing. I've come to realize there are certain conversations we avoid until life forces us to have them. For some people, it's about money. For others, it's the concept of failure. But for many Nigerian men, it's about our fathers. Not because we hate them, not because we don't respect them, but because whenever we think about them, the emotions refuse to stay in one place. One minute you are grateful, the next minute you are angry, then guilty for being angry, then grateful again. It's so confusing. You remember the sacrifices, you could remember the school fees paid, you could remember the mornings they left the home before sunrise, and you could remember the nights they came back long after everyone had eaten. You can definitely remember how hard they worked, but somehow you also remember the silence. You remember wanting to hear "I'm proud of you," but instead you got do better next time. You remember standing with your report card, hoping today would be different, hoping today he would smile, that he would notice your effort. Sometimes he did. Many times he simply nodded and walked away. Now here's the thing. This episode isn't about judging our fathers, because if life has taught me anything, it's that adulthood has a funny way of humbling your opinions. When you were 16, your father looked strict. When you are 26, you start looking tired. By 36, you begin to wonder, how did this man carry all of this without falling apart? And that's when you realize your father wasn't born knowing how to be a father. He was simply a man, learning on the job just like many of us are learning how to become men today. Welcome back to the Nigerian Man Podcast. I am your host, Sanj Marvel. Let's talk. Growing up in Nigeria, our fathers occupied a unique position in the home. They weren't just parents, they were institutions. Their footstep alone could change the atmosphere of the whole house. You may be laughing a minute ago, but when someone whispers that is around, immediately the environment becomes serene. The television volume comes down so drastically. Everybody suddenly remembers the assignment they forgot to do. It may sound funny now, yeah, but back then, that was normal. Respect wasn't requested, it was expected. Fear and respect often looked the same, and because that was all many of us knew, we never questioned it. We just simply assumed that was what fathers are supposed to be: strong, quiet, serious, unavailable, providers, and problem solvers. Men who carried the family on their backs, but rarely carried their children in their arms. Looking back today, I don't think most of our fathers were intentionally distant. I think they genuinely believed that provision was love. If your school fees was paid, they did love you. If there was food on your table, you were loved. If they denied themselves comfort so you could go to the university, that was their way of saying, I love you. But here's the problem. Children don't always understand sacrifice that isn't explained. A child doesn't measure love by the bills you've paid. A child measures love by how safe they feel around you. How often do you listen? How present are you in their life? How willing are you to enter their world? And that's where many Nigerian families quietly struggle. Not because father don't love, but because they loved in a language that children couldn't always understand. Something changed in me a few years ago. I stopped asking, why was my father like that? And I started asking, who was my father before he became my father? Think about that for a second. Before he became daddy, he was somebody else's son. He had dreams. He had fears. He probably had ambition that never happened. He was faced with disappointment he never spoke about. Definitely, he had moments where life knocked him down and nobody helped him back up. Maybe he lost opportunities, maybe he buried friends, maybe he carried responsibility long before he was ready. Maybe nobody ever told him he was enough. But then one day, he becomes an husband. Soon after, a father. And somehow, society expected him to immediately know everything: how to lead, how to provide, how to discipline, how to love, how to protect, but without a manual, without therapy, without permission to fail, without even permission to say, I don't know what I'm doing. Because in our culture, men are expected to have answers, even when life hasn't given them any. So they improvised. Some got it right, some got it wrong. Most got a mixture of both. And perhaps that's the story of almost every father. Not perfection, just survival. Trying to build a family while still trying to build themselves. When we come back, I want us to talk about something many Nigerian men never admitted out loud. The day you realize you started sounding exactly like your father, and whether that's something to celebrate or something to be afraid of. Take a breath. We'll be right back. You know, there comes a moment in every man's life, a moment so ordinary that you almost missed it. You are talking to someone, maybe your younger brother, your wife, or your child, maybe even a stranger. Then you hear yourself speak, not just words, in the tone, the expression, the silence after the sentence, and for a split second you freeze. Because that wasn't your voice, it was your father's. It's strange, isn't it? How people can leave us, yet part of them never do. Sometimes it's the good part. Maybe his resilience, his discipline, his work ethics, his determination, his ability to carry a family through impossible seasons. These are gifts, beautiful gifts. But then, there are the other things also. The anger that appears without warning, the inability to apologize, the habit of swallowing emotions until they become frustration, the belief that asking for help somehow makes you less of a man. Those are inherited too, not through blood, but through observation. Because children are always watching, long before they understood your words. They understand your behavior. They study how you treat your wife. They notice how you react when money becomes tight. They remember how you handle disappointment. They remember whether you laughed or only walked. Either you listened or only just instructed. Either you hugged them or simply nodded from across the room. And that's how fathers and that's how fatherhood travels from one generation to another. Not just through DNA, but through daily habits. Through ordinary moments that seems too small to matter, until years later they become somebody else's normal. Can I tell you something I've noticed? Nigerian men are incredibly good at describing what they do. but we are not very good at describing how we feel. When you ask your man, how's work today? He will talk for 20 minutes. When you ask him, how's your business? He might talk for another 20 minutes. But when you ask him, how are you? He becomes silent. Or the famous response, I did my bro, thank God. And maybe that's exactly how our fathers answered too. Not because they didn't have emotions, but because nobody ever gave them permission to explore them. Just imagine growing up believing that your tears are weakness, that your fears are an embarrassment, that your struggle are your burden alone. Eventually, you stop speaking, not because you don't have anything to say, but because you've convinced yourself that nobody wants to hear it. Our fathers lived in that world, many still do, and if we are honest, some of us are already living there too. We wear strength like an armor. We continue silence. We confuse silence with maturity. We believe endurance is the same thing as healing. It's not. Endurance helps you survive. Healing teaches you how to live. There's a difference, a big difference there. So let me tell you about someone. Let's call him Tunde. Not because that's his real name, but because there are thousands of Tundes in Nigeria. Tunde grew up believing his father didn't love him. His father never attended school events, never said I'm proud of you, never hugged him, never explained anything. Just rules, corrections, expectations. When Tunde graduated from the university, his father shook his hand. Shook his hand. Just imagine that. The biggest accomplishment of your young life, and your father responds like you are closing a business deal. Years passed, Tunde got married. He had a son. Then one evening, his little boy ran into the living room, saying, Daddy, look what I drew. Tunde barely looked up, and he replied, I'm busy. The boy quietly walked away. Nothing dramatic, just walked away. A few minutes later, Tunde caught his own reflection in the television screen, and suddenly, he wasn't looking at himself anymore. He was looking at his father, and in that moment, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't repeating his father's words, he was repeating his father's absence. That night, he walked into his son's room, sat beside him, picked up the drawing, looked at every line, every color, every little mistake. Then he said something he did waited 30 years to hear himself. I'm proud of you. His son smiled, a small smile, probably forgot about it the next day. But Tunde never forgot, because for the first time, he wasn't speaking to his son. He was healing the little boy he used to be. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with receiving something. Sometimes it begins with giving someone else what you never had. I don't believe our generation has to choose between strength and tenderness. No. I think we need both. The world still needs responsible men, disciplined men, dependable men, men who keep their words, men who provide. But maybe the next generation also deserve men who laugh more, who listen better, who will say, I was wrong, but I will do better next time. I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. I'm scared, but I will choose to face it by all means. Not because these are words, which make us weak, but because they make us honest. And honesty is where real strength begins. When we return, I want us to answer the hardest question of this entire podcast. Can you forgive a father who gave you everything you knew, but not everything you needed? Because somewhere between gratitude and grief, that's where many Nigerian men are living. So let's talk about it when we return. There's a question I've always avoided asking for years. Not because I don't know the answer, but because I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. And the question is this: can you love your father and still acknowledge that he did hurt you? Because for many Nigerian men, that's where the struggle begins. We are taught that gratitude and disappointment cannot exist in the same room. That if a man sacrificed for you, you must never question him. That if he paid your school fees, you must ignore the emotional distance. If he worked himself to exhaustion, you must pretend the silence didn't affect you. But life isn't that simple. Humans aren't that simple. And fathers certainly aren't, because the truth is, some of us carried two versions of our father. The father who gave us opportunities, and the father who left us with questions. The father who worked hard, and the father who never truly knew us. And somehow, we spend years trying to decide which version is real. But the answer is both. Both are real. And I think one of the saddest things in life is not conflict, it's silence. The conversation that never happened, the questions never asked, the apologies never spoken, the affection never expressed, the understanding that arrived too late. Some father never told their sons what they were going through, not because they didn't trust them, but because nobody had ever taught them how. So they carried everything alone. From financial pressure, fear, failure, responsibility, regret, all of it, quietly. And many sons looked at that silence and interpreted it as indifferences. Meanwhile, the father thought he was protecting the family. The son thought he was being ignored. And neither one knew how to bridge the gap. That's the tragedy. Not a lack of love, but a lack of language, a lack of emotional vocabulary, a lack of tools. Maybe you've experienced this. You became an adult. Life starts hitting harder. Then the bills arrives, responsibility increases, sleep becomes a luxury. People begin depending on you. And one random day, you suddenly understand something your father used to say. Something that used to annoy you. Something that never made sense before. And you find yourself thinking, so that's what he meant. Not because he was always right, but because experience has finally translated what words could not. Adulthood actually does that. It introduces you to burden you once judged from a distance. And sometimes it creates compassion where anger used to live. Not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually. Now let's be clear about something. Forgiveness is not pretending nothing happened. Forgiveness is not rewriting history. Forgiveness is not denying pain. Some listeners may have fathers who caused deep wound. Some may have fathers who disappeared while they were little. Some may have fathers that haven't spoken to them in years. and some may have fathers who are no longer alive. So when I talk about forgiveness, I'm not talking about erasing your story. I'm talking about refusing to let your story become your prison. Because eventually, pain asks for interest. It demands more than the original wound. It begins affecting relationships, your friendship, marriage, parenting, trust, even your self worth. Everything, let's just say everything. And one day you realize that the person suffering most from old pain is no longer the person who caused it, but you. That's why healing matters, not because the past changes, but because the future can. I honestly believe our generation occupies a unique position. We are standing between two worlds. Behind us, a generation that survived through endurance. Ahead of us, a generation that expects emotional intelligence. And somehow, we are trying to learn both languages at the same time. We understand sacrifice because we watched it. We understand emotional neglect because we've experienced it. And now we have an opportunity not to reject what came before us, but to improve upon it. To keep the resilience, to keep the responsibility, to keep the discipline, but also add presence, emotional awareness, and understanding. Because every generation should leave something better than it found it. So let me tell you what I think. I think most fathers wanted to be fathers, more so better fathers. I really do. I think many of them simply ran out of tools. They ran out of languages. They ran out of being examples. And they ran out of opportunities to learn. And somewhere along the line, life became about survival, not connection, not self discovery, not even about healing, just survival. And maybe the greatest gift we can give ourselves is recognizing that our fathers were often battles we never saw, battles they never spoke about, battles they may not have understood themselves. Again, more so, that doesn't excuse every mistake, but it does make the story more human. And perhaps that's where peace begins. Not in perfect understanding, but in human understanding. So before we leave today, I want you to think about something. If your father walked into this room right now, not as daddy, not as an authority figure, not as the man who raised you, just a man, a regular man, a man with dreams, regrets, failures, victories, fear, pressure, and responsibility, what would you ask him? What would you tell him? Would you thank him? Would you challenge him? Would you forgive him? Would you finally tell him how much his absence affected you? Would you finally tell him how much his sacrifice meant to you? Maybe the answer is all of the above because life rarely gives us simple emotions and fathers rarely leave simple legacies. So here's what I want from you. If your father is still alive, reach out to him. Not because everything is perfect, but because time is undefeated. And one day, the opportunity to have that conversation may no longer exist. If that conversation feels impossible, start smaller. You may start through a text message, a phone call, a question, anything. And if you're already a father or you hope to become one someday, remember this. Your children do not need perfection but examples. They need presence, They need honesty. They need consistency. They need to know that your love isn't hidden behind achievement, that your affection isn't conditional, that your attention isn't something they have to earn, and perhaps most importantly, they need to know that being a man doesn't mean becoming emotionally unreachable. Because strength isn't the absence of feeling, strength is having the courage to feel and still move forward. This is the Nigerian Man Podcast, and I am your host, Sanjay Marvel. And wherever life finds you this week, carry your responsibilities, carry your lessons, carry your growth, but don't carry yesterday's wounds forever. And until next time, carry yourself well.